Good evening, everyone. And I wanted to thank the Commonwealth Club for having me and everyone for being here. It's a real author's dream to have a full house for a book speaking event. And thank you, Gil, for having me on your show and also for moderating tonight. And we'll get to some questions because I know people love to ask questions. I certainly do. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't have that sense of curiosity. So what I'm going to start with, I'm going to actually read you 2 paragraphs from my book. But I'm going to set the stage, so to speak, a little bit first and let you know where Area 51 is, other than in people's imaginations, because it really does exist. And it's located in southern Nevada, about 75 miles north of Las Vegas. It's in a much bigger parcel of land that is the largest federally restricted piece of real estate in the United States. It's about the size of Connecticut, and it's called the Nevada Test and Training Range. Inside of the Nevada Test and Training Range, there's a 1,350 square mile parcel called the Nevada Test Site. And the Nevada Test Site is divided up into quadrants. The quadrant numbers have changed and shifted and gone underground over the years, but in essence, they are 1 through 30, with some mysteriously missing. Area 51 sits just outside of the Nevada Test Site, but inside the greater land parcel that is the Nevada Test and Training Range. And it is there that my book, the basis of my book, centers, and that is where many of the most secret and perhaps most alarming national security projects took place, but also many of the most fantastic ones that kept us all safe, arguably kept us out of World War III with the Russians, certainly helped our pilots in Vietnam. Some really great things went on there and probably continued to go on there today. But with that said, I'm going to read you 2 paragraphs in my book about that really speak to what the book is. And when I was researching the book, I was able to interview a total of 74 men who had rare, unprecedented access to Area 51, 32 of whom lived and worked at the base for extended periods of time. And about 20 of them, I kind of tell their stories, their characters in my book. And one of them that I'm going to be reading about is a pilot, a CIA pilot named Ken Collins. And Ken Collins in this scene is flying the A-12 Oxcart, which was the CIA's original Mach 3 spy plane that flew at 90,000 feet. So Mach 3 is 3 times the speed of sound, and 90,000 feet is about 17 miles up. And this was in the 1960s, so it was radical science and technology at the time, and the spy plane was built to take over after the U-2 spy plane program was outed when Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. So I write, Collins pushed the aircraft through Mach 2.8. In another 45 seconds, he would be out of the danger zone. Nearing 85,000 feet, the inevitable tiny black dots began to appear on the aircraft windshield, sporadic at first, like the first drops of summer rain. Only a few months earlier, scientists at Area 51 had been baffled by those black dots. They worried it was some kind of high-atmosphere corrosion until the mystery was solved in the lab. It turned out the black spots were dead bugs that were cycling around in the upper atmosphere, blasted into the jet stream by the world's 2 superpowers' rally of thermonuclear bombs. The bugs were killed in the bomb's blast and sent aloft to 90,000 feet in the ensuing mushroom clouds as they gained orbit. When I first came across that detail, I found it incredible. I thought to myself, what on earth, or that high up, are bugs doing, dead bugs circling around? And I didn't really understand, being 43 years old, not having lived through the Cold War to the extent that many of my sources did. I wondered, well, I was 40 when I started the book, but I wondered it didn't make much sense to me why these bugs were there. And in essence, it's a bit of an analogy about what Area 51 is. It was set up to conduct espionage on the Soviet Union. The CIA began building its base there in 1955 with the U-2 spy plane because the CIA wanted to spy on Russia and see what they were doing. And one of the other men that I interviewed in my book was Hervey Stockman, and he just passed 2 months ago, which is also a really interesting side note that the men that I interviewed are really in the last chapter of their lives. But Hervey Stockman explained to me what it was like to be the first man to fly over the Soviet Union in a U-2. And yes, he agitated Nikita Khrushchev greatly. And yes, there was a lot of fallout between the Eisenhower administration and the Soviets over this spying that was going on. But at the same time, what Hervey Stockman brought back in the film canisters of his U-2 was over 400,000 square feet of film, of spy footage about what was going on in the Soviet Union. And as Hervey said to me, that the CIA was able to learn and understand that, in fact, the Soviets were not lining up for World War III, as many members of the Air Force wanted to believe. Certainly General LeMay, who's a character in my book as well, you might call him an antagonist. And so when you consider that the CIA's job is to present intelligence to the president based on fact, not fiction, or not speculation, that is what the U-2 spy plane certainly did for us. And I think that was an important notion. But at the same time, there were other elements of the government that were really pushing science, as I write in the book. And I think here's where I get into some of the more dangerous areas and some of the questions that I would like readers to be able to ask of themselves about whether or not pushing science is necessarily a good thing. Right around that same time, or actually if you back up a bit, you know, for a while after World War II, we had an atomic bomb, and then when we found out the Russians had also had an atomic bomb, this was in 1949, there was a big movement toward creating a bigger bomb called the thermonuclear bomb, which is how these bugs got so high up. And Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb at the time, really opposed that on moral grounds. He said it was not a good idea to create a weapon that was larger than its target. In other words, the thermonuclear bomb is so big that it would not wipe out a military installation, it would wipe out a whole city. The thermonuclear bomb that sent the bugs aloft that Ken Collins flew through was actually a thermonuclear bomb that was 10 megatons. And that thermonuclear bomb is big enough, if it's dropped on Manhattan, it would wipe out all 5 boroughs and it would kill 75% of the population down to Washington, D.C. over time. So obviously that's a bomb that's bigger than its target. And in my book, I think one of the more interesting analogies that I came across was that at Area 51, here we were trying to prevent war, so to speak. That's what the CIA was doing with their espionage platforms. And on the other side of the fence, over at the atomic bombing range at the Nevada test site, the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense were practicing how to have a nuclear war. This spy plane that Ken Collins was flying was called the A-12 Oxcart, and although most people have probably never heard of it because it was only declassified by the CIA in 2007, 50 years after its drawings, and one of the characters in my book is the physicist who did those original drawings and helped build stealth for the CIA. But this idea that you could have these two notions working at once is a little bit complicated, preventing a war but practicing to have one. But the point I was making about the Oxcart was that you probably have never seen it or heard of it maybe, but its cousin is very famous, and that is I don't know if this is a military crowd, but it's the SR-71, the Air Force's famous Blackbird,